May 12th, 1940. 6:30 in the morning. The rolling farmland near Hannut, Belgium. Hauptmann Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma squinted through the vision port of his Panzer III, watching the morning mist lift from the wheat fields. His tank company had been advancing through Belgium for 2 days with minimal resistance. The French were retreating, or so intelligence claimed. The blitzkrieg was working exactly as planned. Then he saw them. Massive shapes emerging from the tree line, their silhouettes unlike anything in the recognition manuals. Turrets that seemed too large for their hulls, armour sloped at radical angles, moving with surprising speed across the Belgian countryside. Von Thoma grabbed his radio handset. All units, enemy armour 800 metres, prepare to engage. What happened in the next 72 hours would force German High Command to completely reassess their understanding of armoured warfare. The Battle of Hannut, history's first major tank versus tank engagement, would reveal that Germany's vaunted Panzer divisions were facing an opponent they were fundamentally unprepared to fight. The Somua S35, a French cavalry tank that combined mobility, protection and firepower in ways German designers had never imagined. To understand the shock German tank crews experienced at Hannut, you need to understand what they were driving. The Panzer III, Germany's primary medium tank in 1940, carried a 37mm gun that was effective against most European tanks of the era. Its armour maxed out at 30mm on the front, adequate against most anti-tank weapons of 1939. The Panzer IV, intended as infantry support, mounted a short-barreled 75mm gun designed for firing high-explosive shells, not armour-piercing rounds. Its armour was similarly thin, 30mm at best. German tank doctrine emphasised speed and coordination over heavy armour. The Panzer divisions were designed to exploit breakthroughs and maintain momentum, avoiding direct armour confrontations when possible. This strategy had worked brilliantly in Poland, where Polish tanks were few and generally inferior. Belgium was supposed to be more of the same. The Somua S35 represented an entirely different design philosophy. Designated the Somua S35, short for Société d'outillage mécanique et d'usinage d'artillerie, it was designed in 1935 as a cavalry tank for the French Army's mechanised divisions. The specifications were ambitious. The armour was cast rather than welded or riveted, allowing complex curved shapes that provided better protection per unit of weight. The hull front was 40mm thick, the turret 56mm, with additional sloping that increased effective thickness significantly. This made the S-35 nearly impervious to the 37mm guns equipping most German tanks. The main gun was a 47mm SA-35, one of the most powerful tank guns in the world in 1940. It could penetrate 60mm of armour at 400 metres, more than enough to defeat any German tank from the front. The gun was mounted in a cast turret with excellent traverse and a modern gun sight that allowed accurate fire while moving. The engine was a Somua V8 gasoline engine producing 190 horsepower, giving the 20-ton tank a top speed of 40 km per hour on roads, 25 off-road. This matched or exceeded most German tanks despite the S-35's heavier armour. The suspension used a complex but effective system of springs and bogies that provided excellent cross-country mobility. Perhaps most impressively, the S-35 had a radio. This seems mundane until you realise that most French tanks, including the numerous Renault R-35s and Hotchkiss H-39s, lacked radios entirely. Commanders had to communicate via flags or by dismounting. The S-35 equipped with radios gave French cavalry divisions a coordination capability matching German standards. The French had built approximately 400 Somua S-35s by May 1940, equipping the cavalry divisions of the Division Légère Mécanique, or DLM, mechanised light divisions. These units were France's mobile reserve, designed to counter German armoured thrusts. The 2nd and 3rd DLM, equipped primarily with S-35s and Hotchkiss H-39s, were positioned to defend the Gembloux Gap, a natural invasion corridor in Belgium between the forested Ardennes and the fortified positions further north. The German plan called for Army Group B to drive through Belgium, drawing Allied forces north while the main thrust came through the Ardennes further south. The 3rd and 4th Panzer Divisions, part of General Erich Höppner's 16th Panzer Corps, were assigned to push through the Gembloux Gap, engaging and defeating any French forces that moved to block them. Intelligence suggested the French would deploy infantry divisions, perhaps some scattered tank battalions. Nobody expected concentrated armour. On May 10, 1940, Germany invaded Belgium and the Netherlands. The French 2nd and 3rd DLM immediately began moving north to take up defensive positions. By May 12th, French cavalry units were establishing positions around Hannut, a small Belgian town perfectly positioned to block German advances toward the Gem-Blue Gap. The 2nd DLM under General Pierre Bougrain had approximately 175 tanks, including roughly 80 Somua S35s. The 3rd DLM under General Langlois had similar numbers. These were professional units, well-trained cavalry soldiers who had practiced mechanized maneuvers extensively. The German 3rd and 4th Panzer divisions had over 600 tanks between them, but the majority were Panzers and IIs, light tanks armed with machine guns or 20mm autocannons, useful for reconnaissance but nearly useless in tank combat. The actual fighting strength consisted of perhaps 150 Panzer IIIs and Vs, giving the Germans numerical superiority in medium tanks, but not the overwhelming advantage they were accustomed to. The first contact came on May 12th, around 700 hours near the village of Crehen, northwest of Hannut. A German reconnaissance unit from the 4th Panzer Division encountered French positions unexpectedly. Light Panzer IIs probing the tree line suddenly took fire from concealed positions. Several were knocked out immediately, their thin armour no protection against 47mm guns. The German unit commander, Hauptmann Friedrich Hofmeister, radioed back that he had encountered heavy French tanks in prepared positions. This was concerning, but not yet alarming. The Germans prepared a proper attack with their Panzer IIIs, confident their 37mm guns could handle French armour. After all, they had faced French tanks in World War I, slow, cumbersome things that were hardly a threat to modern Panzers. At 0900 hours, a company of Panzer IIIs advanced toward the French positions near Crehen. The French let them close to 600 metres before opening fire. The results shocked the German crews. The first salvo of 47mm armour-piercing rounds struck 3 Panzer IIIs. 2 penetrated completely, knocking out the tanks instantly. The third struck a frontal armour plate at an angle and still punched through, killing the driver. The German tanks returned fire, their 37mm guns barking rapidly. The crews watched their rounds strike the French tanks, clearly seeing the impacts. The rounds bounced off. At 600 metres, the 37mm guns couldn't penetrate the S-35's frontal armour. The German gunners, well trained and experienced from Poland, adjusted their aim for weak points, turret rings, vision ports, gun mantlets. A few hits connected, causing damage, but most simply ricocheted away in spectacular showers of sparks. Then the French tanks moved. German intelligence had suggested French tanks were slow, suitable for infantry support but incapable of manoeuvre warfare. The S-35s accelerated to 30 km per hour, moving between cover positions while maintaining accurate fire. Their suspension systems absorbed the rough ground, keeping their guns stabilised. German Panzer III crews found themselves facing opponents that could shoot accurately while moving, something their own tanks struggled with. Lieutenant Hans Schaefer, commanding a platoon of Panzer IIIs, later described the encounter in his after-action report. The enemy tanks moved with unexpected speed and fired with devastating accuracy. Our rounds appeared to have no effect unless we achieved a direct hit on specific weak points at close range. Meanwhile, their guns penetrated our frontal armour at ranges where we could not effectively engage them. 3 of my 5 tanks were knocked out within 10 minutes. I ordered withdrawal. By noon on May 12th, the German 4th Panzer Division had committed 2 full tank battalions to the assault around Crehen and made virtually no progress. They had lost 28 tanks knocked out and another 15 damaged. French losses were 7 S-35s and 4 Hotchkiss H-39s, respectable but hardly the one-sided victory German forces had come to expect. General Georg Hans Reinhardt, commanding the 4th Panzer Division, was receiving increasingly desperate reports from his tank commanders. The French tanks were too heavily armoured for 37mm guns. The Panzer IVs with 75mm guns were having better luck, but their short-barreled guns lacked the velocity for effective armour penetration beyond close range. Reinhardt ordered his units to attempt flanking manoeuvres to get shots at the thinner side armour, 35mm on the S-35's hull, still formidable but potentially vulnerable. The problem was that French cavalry doctrine emphasised mobile defence. The S-35s weren't sitting in fixed positions waiting to be flanked. They were moving constantly, taking up new positions, firing, and displacing before German forces could coordinate effective responses. The radios that equipped S-35s allowed unprecedented coordination for a French armoured unit. Tank platoons could communicate with each other and with their company commanders, allowing them to coordinate movements and concentrate fire. While not as sophisticated as German combined arms tactics, it was far more advanced than most French armoured units could manage. At 1400 hours, the German 3rd Panzer Division joined the battle from the northeast, attempting to envelop the French positions. This brought fresh tank companies into contact with the 3rd DLM, near the villages of Thissens and Hannut itself. Again, German crews discovered their weapons were inadequate. Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Munch commanded a company of Panzer IIIs from the 3rd Panzer Division's 5th Panzer Regiment. His company encountered S-35s from the 1st Cuirassiers, an elite French cavalry regiment, in open terrain southeast of Hannut. The engagement took place at ranges between 400 and 800 metres, ideal conditions for gunnery. Munch's company had 12 Panzer IIIs. Within 20 minutes, 7 were knocked out and 2 more damaged. They claimed 3 French tanks destroyed, possibly 4. Munch's report to division headquarters was blunt. The enemy cavalry tanks are superior to our Panzer III in armour, armament and mobility. Direct frontal engagement at normal combat ranges is inadvisable. Request immediate support from 88mm flak guns or heavy artillery. This was an extraordinary admission. The Panzer III was Germany's primary battle tank, designed specifically to fight other tanks. To admit it was inferior to French tanks contradicted everything German propaganda had claimed about Wehrmacht superiority, yet the evidence was undeniable. Knocked-out Panzer IIIs littered the Belgian countryside, their armour penetrated cleanly by 47mm rounds. Meanwhile, damaged S-35s examined by German troops showed dozens of impact marks from 37mm rounds that had failed to penetrate. The problem was metallurgical and geometric. The S-35's cast armour had excellent quality control, with consistent hardness and few weak points. The sloped surfaces increased effective thickness significantly. A 40mm plate angled at 30 degrees provided protection, equivalent to 46mm of vertical armour. The S-35's complex curved surfaces meant that most hits struck at significant angles, further increasing protection. German armour-piercing rounds in 1940 were adequate but not exceptional. The 37mm Panzergranate 40 could penetrate about 35mm of armour at 500 metres when striking perpendicular. Against sloped armour, performance degraded rapidly. The mathematics were unforgiving. By late afternoon on May 12th, German forces had made minimal progress and suffered disproportionate tank losses. General Erich Höppner, commanding 17th Panzer Corps, faced a dilemma. His mission was to break through the Gem-Blue Gap quickly, maintaining the pressure that was essential to German strategy. But his tank forces were being mauled by French cavalry divisions that were supposed to be inferior. Höppner ordered his divisions to bring forward their 88mm flak guns. The famous 88, originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, had already proven its effectiveness against tanks in the Spanish Civil War. Its high-velocity shells could penetrate virtually any armour in existence in 1940. The problem was that 88s were heavy, difficult to position quickly, and vulnerable to enemy fire. Using them in a direct fire role against tanks was improvisation, not doctrine. As darkness fell on May 12th, both sides consolidated positions and assessed damage. The Germans had lost approximately 45 tanks completely destroyed and another 30 damaged. French losses were around 15 tanks destroyed and 12 damaged. More significantly, the German advance had been stopped cold, the first time the Blitzkrieg had encountered effective armoured resistance. At German tank repair facilities behind the lines, mechanics examined knocked-out French tanks brought back for intelligence analysis. What they found was disturbing. The S-35's construction quality was excellent, far better than German intelligence had suggested. The cast armour technique produced complex curved shapes without weak points from welding or riveting. The turret in particular was a masterpiece of casting technology, a single piece of shaped armour with excellent protection from all angles. The 47mm gun was devastating. Examination of knocked-out German tanks showed that the French rounds penetrated cleanly, with the post-penetration effects causing catastrophic internal damage. Spalling, The spray of metal fragments from the inside of armour after a penetrating hit killed crews and detonated ammunition. The German 37mm rounds simply lacked the energy to reliably penetrate the S-35's armour. Hits that did penetrate, usually at close range or against weak points, were often deflected by internal structure, causing damage but not necessarily destroying the tank. Several S-35s had been hit multiple times, had lost tracks or suffered engine damage, but remained potentially repairable. German tank design philosophy had emphasised mobility and mechanical reliability over armour protection. This worked when fighting opponents with similar or inferior armour. Against heavily armoured opponents, it was a recipe for disproportionate losses. On the morning of May 13th, the battle resumed with increased intensity. The Germans had brought forward 88mm guns and were preparing more coordinated combined arms assaults. The French positions around Hannut were being reinforced, but fuel and ammunition supplies were becoming concerning. Here the weaknesses of French doctrine began to tell. While the S-35 itself was an excellent tank, French logistics were inadequate. Fuel trucks were slow to arrive, ammunition resupply was disorganised, maintenance facilities were too far behind the lines to repair damaged tanks quickly. The radio-equipped S-35s could coordinate tactically, but strategic communication between divisions and higher command remained poor. At 800 hours, German forces launched a coordinated assault on French positions near Hannut, combining armour, infantry, artillery, and 88mm flak guns in direct fire roles. The 88s, positioned on high ground with long fields of fire, began engaging S-35s at ranges beyond 1500 metres. At these ranges, the 88's high-velocity shells could penetrate the S-35's armour reliably. French tank commanders found themselves in an impossible situation. Advancing meant exposing themselves to 88mm fire they couldn't effectively return. The S-35's 47mm gun, excellent in tank versus tank combat, lacked the range and power to engage the distant 88s effectively. Retreating meant giving up defensive positions and allowing German tanks to advance. Captain Marcel Lefebvre, commanding a squadron of S-35s from the 4th Cuirassiers, attempted to suppress the German 88 positions with manoeuvre and fire. His squadron of 15 tanks advanced rapidly, using terrain for cover, attempting to close the range. German artillery and mortar fire bracketed the advancing tanks. Then the 88s opened fire. The first hit struck Lefebvre's command tank on the turret front, the highest velocity impact the S-35's armour would face in combat. The shell penetrated, killing the gunner and loader instantly. Lefebvre, wounded by fragments, ordered his squadron to withdraw. They had lost 5 tanks destroyed and 3 damaged without getting close enough to effectively engage the 88s. The 88mm guns represented a level of firepower that the S-35 simply wasn't designed to face. While its armour was excellent against other tanks, it couldn't stand up to dedicated anti-tank guns firing high-velocity shells. This wasn't a failure of the S-35's design. No tank in 1940 could reliably survive 88mm fire at reasonable ranges. It was a reality of the evolving arms race between armour and guns. By midday on May 13th, the French position around Hannut was becoming untenable. German forces were infiltrating between defensive positions, threatening encirclement. Fuel and ammunition were running low. Orders came from higher command to withdraw to new defensive lines closer to the main French positions in the Gembloux Gap. The withdrawal was conducted in good order, with S-35s providing covering fire as French units pulled back. German forces attempted to pursue but found that even in withdrawal, the French cavalry tanks were dangerous. Several German tank companies that pressed too aggressively during the withdrawal were ambushed by S-35s positioned in hasty defensive positions, losing tanks before the French tanks withdrew to new positions. By evening on May 13th, the Battle of Hannut was essentially over, though scattered combat continued for another day. The French had conducted the first significant armoured delaying action of the war, inflicting disproportionate losses on German forces while withdrawing in good order. The strategic situation, however, remained grim. While 16th and Panzer Corps had been delayed at Hannut, the main German thrust through the Ardennes was proceeding faster than anyone had anticipated. Within days, German armour would reach the English Channel, cutting off the Allied armies in Belgium. The tactical victory at Hannut meant little in the face of strategic disaster, but the impact on German thinking was profound. After-action reports from the 3rd and 4th Panzer divisions painted a disturbing picture. The French cavalry tanks were superior to German medium tanks in almost every measurable way. The 37mm gun equipping the Panzer III was inadequate. German tank armour was too thin. If the French had more S-35s and used them more aggressively, German armour would face serious problems. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armour doctrine, read the reports from Hannut with concern. In his diary he noted, "The French have excellent tanks. If they had more of them and better doctrine for their employment, we would face a very difficult situation. Our technical superiority is not as great as we believed." The technical intelligence gathered from captured and knocked out S-35s led to immediate changes in German tank development. The Panzer III would be upgunned, first to a 50mm gun, later to longer-barreled versions with improved armour penetration. Armour thickness on new production tanks would be increased. The development of the Panzer V Panther and Panzer VI Tiger, with their sloped armour and powerful guns, incorporated lessons learned from facing the S-35. From the French perspective, Hannut demonstrated that their modern tanks could compete with German armour when properly employed. The problem was that they didn't have enough of them. Of the approximately 3,000 tanks available to French forces in May 1940, only about 400 were S-35s. The majority were older designs, Renault FT-17s from World War I, Renault R-35s and Hotchkiss H-39s with inadequate guns, and FCM-36s with thin armour. The heavier Char B-1 Biz, arguably the most powerful tank in the world in 1940, was available in only about 300 examples and suffered from crippling mechanical unreliability and poor ergonomics, with the commander having to aim and fire the hull-mounted 75mm gun himself while also commanding the tank. Even with excellent tanks like the S-35, French doctrine proved inadequate. Tank units were scattered among infantry divisions as support weapons rather than concentrated in armoured divisions like German Panzers. Communication and coordination above the tactical level remained poor. Logistics couldn't support sustained mobile operations. Leadership was often hesitant, trained in World War I methodical battle rather than mobile warfare. After the battle, interviews with German tank crews revealed the psychological impact of facing superior enemy tanks. For crews trained to believe in German technical superiority, discovering that French tanks outclassed their own was profoundly disturbing. Unteroffizier Paul Richter, a Panzer III gunner who survived Hannut, later recalled, "We had been told the French had nothing to match our Panzers. Then we encountered these cavalry tanks that shrugged off our shells while their guns punched through our armour like paper. 3 times I scored direct hits on one French tank at 500 metres. 3 times the shells bounced away. Then he fired once, and my friend's tank next to me exploded. The confidence we had from Poland evaporated in minutes." The Somua S35's excellence makes its relative obscurity in popular history puzzling. Unlike the Sherman, T-34, or Panther, the S-35 rarely appears in documentaries or books about tank warfare. Part of this is due to France's rapid defeat in 1940. The S-35's finest moment came in a losing campaign, overshadowed by strategic disaster. But for a brief period in May 1940, it was arguably the best medium tank in the world. Its combination of mobility, armour and firepower was unmatched by any tank in comparable weight class. The Soviet T-34, often credited as the first modern medium tank with sloped armour and a powerful gun, wouldn't appear until 1941. The German Panzer IV wouldn't receive a long-barreled high-velocity gun until 1942. The American M4 Sherman wouldn't enter service until 1942, and its 75mm gun had less armour penetration than the S-35's 47mm. For armour protection, the S-35's 56mm of well-sloped turret armour provided better protection than the Sherman's 76mm of vertical armour in many circumstances. After France's surrender in June 1940, Germany captured approximately 300 intact S-35s. Rather than scrapping these supposedly inferior French tanks, the Germans pressed them into service. They were used for occupation duties, training, and even combat operations on the Eastern Front early in Operation Barbarossa. The Germans designated them Panzerkampfwagen 35S-739F, and some served until 1944. This continued use by German forces speaks to the S-35's quality more eloquently than any technical specification. If the tanks were as inferior as German propaganda claimed, they would have been scrapped immediately. Instead, they were valued enough to see continued combat service for years. The technical specifications tell only part of the S-35's story. The design incorporated several innovations that were ahead of their time. The cast turret and hull sections allowed complex shapes impossible, with welded or riveted construction. Modern tanks still use cast armor components for precisely this reason. The radio installation gave tactical flexibility that most French tanks lacked. The suspension provided excellent cross-country mobility, essential for cavalry operations. The main gun, while smaller than later war weapons, had excellent armor penetration for its size due to its high muzzle velocity. But design excellence couldn't overcome strategic and doctrinal failures. The S-35s were scattered among cavalry divisions that were used incorrectly, committed piecemeal rather than concentrated for maximum effect. The logistical support necessary for sustained armoured operations didn't exist in French doctrine. Coordination with infantry, artillery and air support was poor compared to German combined arms tactics. Individual French tank crews and units often fought with great courage and skill. The men of the 2nd and 3rd DLM at Hannut demonstrated that French soldiers could match German forces in combat when properly equipped and led. The problem wasn't the quality of French troops or tanks, it was the system surrounding them. One often overlooked aspect of the S-35's design was its ergonomics. The commander's position in the turret provided excellent visibility through multiple periscopes and vision blocks. The turret traverse was powered, unusual for the era, allowing quick target acquisition. The commander had an actual commander's cupola with 360-degree vision. The driver's position was comfortable with good forward visibility. The fighting compartment was reasonably spacious. Compare this to German tanks of the period, where commanders often had to serve as gunners in early Panzer III's, or Soviet tanks like the T-34, where crew conditions were notoriously cramped and visibility poor. The S-35 was designed to be fought by human beings, with consideration for the crew's ability to operate effectively in combat. The Battle of Hannut demonstrated this through the consistent accuracy of French gunnery, even while moving. This wasn't luck, it was the result of good design allowing well-trained crews to perform effectively. After World War II, when military historians began seriously analysing the 1940 campaign, Hannut received relatively little attention. The French defeat overshadowed everything else. But German military analysts, particularly those studying tank warfare, paid close attention to the lessons. Post-war interviews with German tank commanders consistently ranked the S-35 as one of the most dangerous opponents they faced in 1940. General von Thoma, who had commanded tanks at Hannut, later stated, "The French Somua was a very good tank, better than anything we had at the time. If they had used it properly with concentrated armour divisions and better doctrine, the 1940 campaign could have been very different." This is perhaps overstating the case. French problems went far beyond tank doctrine, but it's significant that German commanders who actually fought against S-35s held them in high regard, in contrast to the dismissive propaganda aimed at public audiences. The mythology of German technical superiority in 1940 persists in popular history. The reality, as Hannut demonstrated, was more nuanced. German success came from superior doctrine, better coordination, more aggressive leadership and strategic surprise. Not from having better tanks. In the specific domain of medium tank design, the French S-35 was arguably superior to anything Germany fielded in 1940. The tragedy is that France had too few of them and used them incorrectly. 3 years later, when Soviet T-34s shocked German tank crews on the Eastern Front, the pattern would repeat. German forces would discover they faced tanks superior to their own. The difference was that the Soviets had thousands of T-34s and were learning to use them effectively, while France had only hundreds of S-35s and never developed effective armoured doctrine. The S-35's post-war fate was ignominious. Most of the captured examples used by Germany were eventually destroyed in combat or scrapped. A few survived the war and were used by French and other armies in training roles into the 1950s. Today, approximately 50 S-35s survive in various conditions around the world, preserved in museums as reminders of what might have been. If you see an S-35 in a museum, take time to look closely. Notice the sophisticated curves of the cast armour. Imagine trying to penetrate that armour with a 37mm gun at 500 metres. The frustration of watching your shells bounce away while the S-35's gun punched through your own armour. Consider what it meant to German tank crews in May 1940 to discover that the enemy had better tanks than they did. The Battle of Hannut stands as a footnote in histories of World War II, but for the German tank crews who fought there, it was a revelation. The invincible Wehrmacht had met an opponent it couldn't easily defeat. The French cavalry tanks, particularly the Somua S35, had demonstrated that German armour was not superior, that the blitzkrieg could be stopped by properly equipped and positioned forces. The fact that France lost the campaign anyway doesn't diminish what happened at Hannut. For 3 days, French cavalry divisions delayed 2 Panzer divisions, inflicting disproportionate casualties, demonstrating that German armour could be defeated. The Somua S35, an excellent tank deployed in inadequate numbers with flawed doctrine, had its moment. German Panzer crews learned respect for French engineering the hard way, through burning tanks and dead comrades. The lessons learned at Hannut would influence German tank design for the rest of the war. The upgunning of the Panzer III, the development of the Panther with its sloped armour, the emphasis on more powerful anti-tank guns, all traced their lineage in part to the shock of facing S-35s in May 1940. In the end, industrial capacity, strategic planning, and doctrinal flexibility won the war. But in the wheat fields around Hannut in May 1940, for a brief moment, French cavalry tanks and their crews showed what was possible. The Somua S-35 wasn't just a good tank on paper, it was an excellent tank in combat, superior to its German opponents in almost every measurable way. That the excellence of the machine couldn't overcome the failures of the system that deployed it is one of the tragedies of the 1940 campaign. German Panzer crews who fought at Hannut carried the memory of those encounters for the rest of their lives. The shock of facing superior enemy tanks, the frustration of watching their shells bounce harmlessly away, the terror of 47mm rounds punching through their armour. These were lessons learned in blood and fire, lessons that would reshape German tank development and doctrine. The Somua S-35 had shocked the Wehrmacht. That it couldn't save France doesn't diminish that achievement. The German tank development programs initiated after the French campaign bore the direct imprint of Hannut. In August 1940, just 2 months after France's surrender, German ordnance officials met to discuss the future of armoured warfare. The minutes from these meetings, captured after the war, reveal how profoundly the encounter with French tanks had affected German thinking. Colonel General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, opened the August 15th meeting with a stark assessment. Our Panzer III is adequate for fighting the tanks we expected to face, but inadequate for fighting the tanks we actually encountered. The French Somua and Char B1 demonstrated armour protection and firepower, exceeding our specifications. We were fortunate that French doctrine and leadership were so poor, because their equipment was in many cases superior to ours. This was a remarkable admission from the leadership of an army that had just conquered France in 6 weeks. But the officers who had actually fought at Hannut and other engagements knew the truth. German victory had come despite inferior tanks, not because of superior ones. The immediate result was the decision to upgun the Panzer III from 37mm to 50mm. Initially, this would be the short-barreled 50mm L42 gun, which still proved inadequate. Eventually, the longer L60 version would be adopted, providing the armour penetration German crews had desperately needed at Hannut. But even this was recognised as a stopgap measure. The real solution was already being sketched on drafting tables. What would become the Panther tank incorporated the sloped armour philosophy, demonstrated by the S-35, though the Germans would claim credit for copying the Soviet T-34. In reality, German designers had encountered effective sloped armour first at Hannut, not on the Eastern Front. The VK-30.2 prototype that led to the Panther featured armour angles directly influenced by examination of captured S-35s. German metallurgists studied the S-35's cast armour construction extensively. The French had achieved excellent quality control in their casting process, producing armour with consistent hardness and minimal flaws. German attempts to replicate this process ran into production difficulties. Cast armour required sophisticated foundry techniques that German industry had not fully developed. They would eventually succeed, but not until later in the war, and never with the consistency French foundries had achieved in 1935. The ammunition used in the S-35's 47mm gun also received detailed analysis. The French armour-piercing rounds used a penetrating cap design that improved performance against face-hardened armour. The projectile itself was well designed with good sectional density, the ratio of mass to cross-sectional area that determines penetration ability. German 37mm ammunition was redesigned based partly on these captured examples, though the fundamental problem of insufficient calibre remained. Perhaps most significant was the recognition that tank design required balancing protection, firepower, and mobility rather than emphasizing any single characteristic. The Panzer III had prioritized mobility and mechanical reliability, while accepting thin armour. This worked against inferior opponents, but failed against equals or superiors. Future German tanks would need to match or exceed potential enemies in all characteristics simultaneously. The irony is that French designers had reached this balanced approach 5 years earlier with the S-35, but French doctrine prevented proper exploitation of their technical advantage. On the Eastern Front, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, some S-35s were included in the invasion force. German units equipped with captured French tanks initially viewed this as a sign they were receiving inferior equipment. That perception changed quickly when they encountered Soviet armour. The S-35's 47mm gun proved effective against early production T-34s at the turret ring and other weak points, something German 37mm guns could rarely achieve. The S-35's armour, while not up to T-34 standards, was thick enough to provide reasonable protection against Soviet 45mm tank and anti-tank guns at medium ranges. German after-action reports from the Eastern Front in 1941 frequently mentioned that French tanks, particularly the S-35, performed better than expected. Some units specifically requested to keep their S-35s rather than receiving German tanks as replacements. This represented a complete reversal from the mockery of French equipment that had characterized German attitudes before actually using it in combat. Hauptmann Werner Paulsen, commanding a company equipped with S-35s in southern Russia in September 1941, wrote to his brother, "The French cavalry tanks are proving quite useful. They are reliable, the gun is adequate against most targets, and the armour provides good protection. I would rather have a Panzer IV, but I would take an S-35 over a Panzer III with a small gun any day. The French built a good tank, they simply did not know how to use it." The continued German use of captured S-35s highlights an important aspect of the tank's design, reliability. While French armour generally had a poor reputation for mechanical reliability, the S-35 was an exception. The Somua V8 engine, though not particularly powerful by later standards, was robust and maintainable. The suspension, while complex, was durable. German units reported that S-35s required less maintenance than many German tanks and could operate for extended periods without major mechanical issues. This reliability was partly due to the S-35's origins as a cavalry tank designed for mobile operations. French cavalry doctrine emphasized sustained movement, requiring tanks that could operate for days without extensive maintenance. The result was a design that prioritized mechanical durability, even if it meant accepting somewhat lower peak performance than might otherwise be possible. Compare this to the German Panther tank, which when finally introduced in 1943, suffered from chronic mechanical problems. The Panther's final drive and transmission were particularly problematic, frequently failing after relatively short operational periods. German attempts to maximize performance resulted in a tank that was theoretically superior, but practically unreliable. The S-35, designed 5 years earlier with more conservative engineering, actually achieved better operational readiness rates. French engineering in the 1930s emphasized quality and durability over cutting-edge performance. This reflected France's experience in World War I, where mechanical reliability often mattered more than slight performance advantages. The S-35 embodied this philosophy. It wasn't the fastest tank possible, the most heavily armoured, or the most heavily armed, but it was reliable, maintainable, and effective. German engineers studying captured S-35s in detail were impressed by the attention to practical engineering concerns. The engine was accessible for maintenance. The transmission, while not as sophisticated as German designs, was simple enough that field repairs were practical. The suspension could be serviced without extensive disassembly. These were unglamorous considerations, but they determined whether a tank would actually be available for combat or sitting in a repair depot. The ammunition stowage in the S-35 also received attention. French designers had positioned ammunition bins low in the hull, reducing the likelihood of catastrophic detonation if the tank was penetrated. This contrasted with some German tanks where ammunition was stored in more vulnerable locations for crew convenience. The S-35's arrangement meant that even when penetrated, there was a reasonable chance the ammunition wouldn't immediately explode, giving the crew a chance to escape. Survival rates for S-35 crews whose tanks were knocked out were notably higher than for many other French tanks of the period. The cast armour, while it couldn't always prevent penetration, tended to fail in ways that were less catastrophic for the crew than welded or riveted armour. Penetrations produced cleaner holes with less spalling and fragmentation. This was small comfort when facing an 88mm gun, but against smaller caliber weapons it made a significant difference. French tankers who survived the 1940 campaign and later served with the Free French Forces or in the Resistance often spoke highly of the S-35. Lieutenant Jean Perrin, who commanded an S-35 at Hannut and later fought with the Free French in North Africa, recounted after the war, "The Somua was a beautiful tank to fight in, good vision, comfortable, reliable. The gun was powerful and accurate. The armour gave you confidence. You knew you could take hits and survive. The problem was never the tank. It was how we were ordered to use them, scattered in small groups supporting infantry, reacting to German moves rather than attacking ourselves. Give me a squadron of S-35s with German doctrine, and I could have made the Panzer divisions very uncomfortable." This sentiment, that French equipment was good, but French doctrine was poor, was common among French veterans. It was also a convenient narrative that avoided confronting deeper issues with French military culture, leadership and strategic planning. But in the specific case of the S-35, the assessment was accurate. The tank was genuinely excellent. Its employment was not. After the war, when the French army was rebuilt, there was serious consideration given to putting the S-35 back into production. Enough manufacturing equipment had survived, and the design was still competitive with many tanks in service in 1945. Ultimately, the decision was made to proceed with more modern designs, but the fact that the S-35 was even considered for post-war production, a full decade after its introduction, speaks to the soundness of its design. Several S-35s did see post-war service. The French used some for training and occupation duties. A few were transferred to other nations. Israel received some French armour in the 1950s, though whether this included S-35s remains disputed among historians. By the mid-1950s, the remaining S-35s were hopelessly obsolete, and they were retired to museums or scrapped. The legacy of the S-35 in tank design is difficult to trace precisely because so many of its innovations became standard practice. Sloped armour, cast construction, balanced performance characteristics, these were all present in the S-35 and became universal in later tank design. It's impossible to say definitively which later tanks were directly influenced by the S-35 versus arriving at similar solutions independently, but the chronology suggests the French were ahead of the curve. American tank designers certainly examined S-35s. Several were brought to the United States for testing after France's surrender, acquired through various channels. While American designers were developing what would become the M4 Sherman independently, they had access to French technical data. The Sherman's cast hull sections and emphasis on reliability echo aspects of S-35 design philosophy, though the Sherman was a much larger tank designed for mass production on a scale French industry never attempted. Soviet designers almost certainly never saw an S-35, given the timeline of the French collapse and the state of Soviet-French relations. Yet the T-34, introduced in 1941, shares the S-35's emphasis on sloped armour and balanced characteristics. This appears to be convergent evolution, both design teams arriving at similar solutions to the same problems, rather than direct influence. The fact that teams working independently reach similar conclusions validates the S-35's design approach. The technical specifications that made the S-35 formidable in 1940 help explain why it remained relevant throughout the war, even as other 1930s tanks became obsolete. The 47mm gun, while insufficient against heavy tanks like the Tiger or Panther, remained effective against medium tanks and lighter vehicles throughout the war. The armour, though eventually surpassed by later designs, was thick enough to provide protection against common threats. The mobility allowed the S-35 to keep up with more modern tanks in many situations. Compare the S-35's service life to other pre-war tanks. The German Panzer II were obsolete by 1941. The British Matilda, contemporary with the S-35, was retired from frontline service by 1943. The Soviet T-26 and BT series were largely gone by 1942, yet the S-35 remained in German service until 1944, a testament to its fundamental soundness. The relatively small number of S-35s produced, only about 400, means that its impact was limited by scarcity rather than capability. This raises interesting counterfactual questions. What if France had prioritised S-35 production over older designs? What if they had built 2,000 S-35s instead of 400? What if they had concentrated them in proper armoured divisions with German-style doctrine? These questions can never be answered definitively, but the performance at Hannut suggests that in different circumstances, the S-35 could have significantly altered the course of the 1940 campaign. France produced approximately 300 of the vastly inferior Renault R-35, a slow, undergunned infantry tank that was obsolete before it entered service. The resources used for R-35 production could have built hundreds more S-34s. Similarly, the Hotchkiss H-39, while decent, was inferior to the S-35 in most respects. Concentrating production on the S-35 would have given France a more capable armoured force, though whether this would have been enough to overcome doctrinal and leadership failures is debatable. German intelligence estimates from 1939 suggested France had approximately 3,000 tanks, giving them substantial numerical superiority over Germany's roughly 2,500. But the German tanks were concentrated in Panzer divisions designed for mobile warfare, while French tanks were scattered among infantry divisions. If France had matched Germany's organisational approach and equipped their armoured divisions primarily with S-35s, the balance of power would have been very different. Hannut demonstrated what was possible when S-35s were properly concentrated and employed. Imagine that battle repeated across the entire front, with French armoured divisions intercepting German thrusts with superior tanks and adequate doctrine. At minimum, the blitzkrieg would have been significantly slowed. More optimistically, German armour might have been defeated in detail, forced into attritional warfare where Germany's material disadvantages would become critical. But this speculation assumes France could have reformed its military doctrine, command structure, and strategic thinking, something that proved impossible in the peacetime years despite clear warnings of German rearmament. The S-35 was a symptom of a broader pattern in French military development, excellent tactical capabilities undermined by poor operational and strategic implementation. Individual French weapons were often world-class. The S-35 tank, the Maginot Line fortifications, the 75mm model 1897 field gun. These were all excellent designs. The problem was the system that employed them, defensive-minded, slow to react, unable to coordinate combined arms operations effectively, led by commanders whose thinking was rooted in World War I. At Hannut, German commanders outmaneuvered French forces despite having inferior tanks. The Germans concentrated forces at decisive points, coordinated armour with air support and artillery, and maintained operational tempo that kept French forces reacting rather than acting. French commanders, even with superior tanks, fought a methodical battle that allowed Germans to bring forward 88mm guns and eventually force a French withdrawal. The individual courage and skill of French tank crews couldn't overcome systemic dysfunction. When analysing the S-35's performance, it's essential to separate the capability of the machine from the competence of the organisation employing it. As a tank, the S-35 was world-class in 1940, arguably the best medium tank available to any army. As part of the French military system, its effectiveness was severely compromised by factors beyond its technical specifications. German soldiers who fought against S-35s and later used captured examples understood this distinction. They respected the tank as a machine while recognising that French employment had been flawed. This professional assessment stands in contrast to propaganda claims of French weakness and German superiority, which served political purposes but didn't reflect battlefield reality. The Battle of Hannut remains one of the least known significant engagements of World War II. It was overshadowed almost immediately by the German breakthrough at Sedan, the encirclement of Allied forces, and the dramatic evacuation at Dunkirk. In the grand narrative of France's defeat, a 3-day tank battle in Belgium seemed like a minor footnote, but for the development of armoured warfare, Hannut was significant. It was the first major tank versus tank battle in history, the first time hundreds of tanks fought each other in mobile warfare rather than in static World War I conditions. The lessons learned at Hannut influenced tank design and doctrine for the remainder of the war. For the Germans, Hannut was a warning that their armour was not invincible, and that other nations could produce competitive or superior designs. This drove the development of better tanks and more powerful guns, directly contributing to the arms race that produced Tigers, Panthers, and the long-barreled Panzer V's that dominated the Middle War years. For the Allies, particularly the Americans and British, observing from a distance, Hannut demonstrated the importance of armour protection and gun power, not just mobility. Early American tank designs like the M3 Grant emphasized armour and gun power, even at the expense of mobility, reflecting lessons from France's defeat. The British, already developing heavy infantry tanks like the Churchill, continued that development while also creating fast cruiser tanks, attempting to cover both roles that the Germans had merged in their Panzer divisions. The S-35 represented a middle path, a tank with enough armour to fight other tanks, enough firepower to be decisive, and enough mobility to conduct mobile operations. This balanced approach would eventually become the universal standard in the form of the main battle tank concept that emerged in the post-war period. Tanks like the American M48 Patton, Soviet T-54, and British Centurion embodied the principle the S-35 had demonstrated, that a successful tank must be good at everything, not excellent at one thing and weak at others. In the museums where surviving S-35s reside, they rarely receive the attention given to Tigers, Shermans, or T-34s. This is understandable given their limited numbers and the brevity of their combat service with French forces. But for historians of armoured warfare, the S-35 deserves recognition as one of the pivotal tanks of the pre-war period. Its design anticipated developments that other nations would not achieve until years later. Consider the timeline. The S-35 entered service in 1936 with sloped armour, a powerful gun, and balanced characteristics. The German Panther, which embodied similar design principles and is often credited as revolutionary, entered service in 1943. 7 years separated these tanks, and yet their fundamental design philosophies were remarkably similar. The Germans had the benefit of combat experience against British, Soviet, and American tanks when designing the Panther. The French designed the S-35 with only theoretical knowledge and the experience of World War I to guide them. That they produced such an effective design speaks to the quality of French engineering in the interwar period. The French armour industry in the 1930s was sophisticated and capable. Companies like Somua, Renault, Hotchkiss, and FCM had the technical expertise and manufacturing capability to produce world-class armoured vehicles. The problem was not French industry but French military doctrine that failed to specify what was actually needed. The S-35 succeeded because the cavalry branch, more progressive than the infantry, specified requirements that produced a modern tank. If similar thinking had guided French armour development broadly, rather than being confined to cavalry units, France might have entered the war with a much more capable armoured force. After the war, when military historians began seriously analysing the 1940 campaign, they focused primarily on strategic and operational failures. The Ardennes breakthrough, the failure to counterattack at Sedan, the poor coordination between French and British forces, these were the explanations for defeat. The performance of individual weapon systems received less attention, but when specialists did examine technical aspects, they consistently found that French equipment was often competitive or superior to German equivalents. The S-35 was simply the most clear-cut example of French technical excellence undermined by systemic dysfunction. In recent decades, as archives have opened and more detailed analysis has become possible, military historians have revised their assessments of French capabilities in 1940. The narrative of French weakness and obsolescence has given way to a more nuanced understanding that recognises French strengths, while explaining how those strengths were squandered. The S-35 fits perfectly into this revised understanding. It was an excellent tank that should have been a decisive weapon, but instead became a footnote because the system employing it was dysfunctional. The German tank crews who faced S-35s at Hannut carried those memories for the rest of their lives. In the chaos and terror of armoured combat, discovering that your weapon is inferior to your enemies is psychologically devastating. Training and doctrine had taught German tankers that their equipment was superior that German engineering and military thinking led the world. Hannut shattered those comfortable assumptions. The fact that Germany went on to win the campaign didn't erase the memory of those first encounters, watching your shells bounce off while enemy rounds punched through your armour. Veterans interviewed decades later still spoke about the S-35 with a mixture of respect and residual fear. It had been a dangerous opponent, more dangerous than propaganda admitted, and only superior German tactics and operational planning had overcome the technical disadvantage. This honest assessment from men who had actually fought stands in stark contrast to the dismissive propaganda of the time. For historians seeking to understand the Battle of Hannut and the S-35's role in it, primary sources present challenges. French military records were largely destroyed or captured in 1940. German records are more complete but reflect the biases of the victors. Post-war memoirs from both sides must be treated cautiously, as memory is fallible, and participants had reasons to shape narratives in particular ways. But the technical evidence is irrefutable. Knocked-out tanks examined after battle, captured examples tested extensively, combat reports from multiple sources, all confirm the same basic facts. The S-35 was heavily armoured, well-armed and mobile. German 37mm guns couldn't reliably penetrate its armour at normal combat ranges. Its 47mm gun could defeat any German tank in service in 1940. These are not matters of interpretation, but of physics and metallurgy. The broader significance of the S-35 extends beyond its specific technical characteristics to what it represents about the nature of military effectiveness. Having the best equipment is not sufficient for victory if doctrine, organisation, leadership and logistics are inadequate. Germany's success in 1940 came from excellence in these supporting areas, despite often having inferior equipment. France's defeat came from dysfunction in these areas despite often having superior equipment. This lesson has relevance far beyond World War II. Throughout military history, forces with better equipment have lost to opponents with better doctrine and organisation. The S-35 is simply a particularly clear example of this pattern. It serves as a reminder that in military affairs, the whole system matters more than any single component, however excellent. In the final analysis, the Somua S35 deserves recognition as one of the finest tanks of its era, and a design that influenced the development of armoured warfare. Its performance at Hannut demonstrated capabilities that shocked German tank crews and forced a reassessment of German armour development. That it could not save France from defeat reflects not on the tank, but on the system that employed it. The S-35 had its moment in the wheat fields around Hannut in May 1940. For 3 days, French cavalry tankers showed what was possible with properly designed equipment and competent tactical leadership. They inflicted disproportionate losses on German forces and delayed the advance of 2 Panzer divisions. That this tactical success meant nothing in the face of strategic collapse is tragic, but doesn't diminish the achievement. German Panzer crews learned at Hannut that French tanks were not the obsolete relics their propaganda portrayed. They learned that armour, firepower and mobility mattered in ways their pre-war doctrine had underestimated. They learned that the blitzkrieg could be stopped by properly equipped and positioned forces. These were expensive lessons, paid for with destroyed tanks and dead comrades. The Somua S35 had delivered those lessons with devastating effectiveness, firing 47mm rounds that penetrated German armour and shattered German assumptions. For a brief moment, before strategic disaster overwhelmed tactical success, the S-35 had been exactly what French cavalry had wanted, a fast, heavily armoured, hard-hitting tank capable of meeting any opponent on equal or better terms. The shock German Panzer crews experienced at Hannut was real, profound and influential. The Somua S-35 had proven itself in the only test that ultimately matters, combat against a skilled and determined enemy. That it passed that test with distinction remains true, regardless of France's defeat in the broader campaign.